So I'm delighted to bring this talk to you today and talk to you about two NIH initiatives, and they have some similarities between them, and I will point those out. The first one I'm going to talk about is PROMIS, and I'm going to start with it for a couple of reasons. One is that it predates the Toolbox, which is the other effort that I'll be talking about, and the other is that some of the methods that I'll introduce to you are also methods that are used in Toolbox. So by kind of going through and giving you a little bit of a step-by-step about PROMIS, perhaps you'll be prepared to understand more about the Toolbox effort. I also have to admit that I know more about PROMIS than I do about Toolbox, and certainly more about the domains. So there will come a time in this presentation in which I am speaking in words that I don't quite understand, and I will alert you so that you are aware that I am aware that that part of my presentation came from Dr. Richard Gershon, who is the PI for Toolbox. So let's look at PROMIS. The goals of PROMIS, this is a big NIH initiative, and the goal was to develop a system of measurements of patient-reported health status measures. And the domains of interest were physical, mental, and social well-being. And as I'm going to show you, there's a lot of things that are underneath each of those domains. The reason those particular ones were picked is because they were domains that it was felt were relevant across a lot of chronic diseases. And this is one way in which PROMIS, I'll show you, contrast a little bit from Toolbox emphasis, because in PROMIS it really is about what are the measures, what are the outcomes that go across many, many different kinds of chronic conditions. So here's the PROMIS domain framework, and this is not expanded, this is just the overall, so I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to each of these, or a couple of these, just for your information, and also I wanted them to be on the slides so that if you copy the slides down later, you'll have them for your reference. So self-reported health, as I mentioned, was divided up into physical health, mental health, and social health. And as you can see, there's a lot of branches off of those. But then if we just take physical health, these are the banks that are available right now, just as of this year. So under adult, pain behavior, pain interference, fatigue, sleep disturbance, sleep impairment, physical function, sexual function, and then many of those also are available in pediatric banks. And though I haven't included this in my slide, many of the measures in PROMIS, in fact, probably almost a large number have been translated into Spanish, but in addition into many other languages as well. So here's an example of that mental health component. So you see the kinds of things there, anxiety, depression, anger, etc. And under the pediatric, there's 3, anxiety, depression, and anger, just those first 3. So one of the things about PROMIS, and it's also true of Toolbox, is the measurement strategy is different from the classical approach. And you know the classical approach is something like this. A couple of people who are experts sit around over a beer, write out some questions on a napkin, and then they administer it. I like to say that the problem with self-reported outcome measures is they look like something that you can make in your garage over the weekend, right? But in fact, there are, as I'm sure those of you who are interested in this are very much aware of how much there is to the research behind how you ask questions and the questions that you ask. So generally, the old school approach to measurement, and still one that works very well for many applications, is to have a list of items. It's one form, and everybody answers the same items. The approach used in PROMIS and in Toolbox is called item banking. So you can just picture this as thinking about the universe of items that could be asked about a particular outcome and banking those into a single repository and then withdrawing those to make short forms, to make longer forms, to make forms that have specific relevance for a particular population, and as I'm going to show you later, also using them for tailored assessment. So if you have this whole large sample of items in this item bank, what holds them together and makes it possible for you to use subsets of them is something called item response theory, which is a mathematical equation. And we say that these items are calibrated on a common metric. Another way to think about that is that we arrange them by difficulty along the continuum of what we're going to measure. And I'm going to show you some slides later. This is so you can hear it once, and you're about to hear it a second time as well. So don't be alarmed. Now, as I said, the really nice thing about an item banking approach is that any subset of those items can be used to get a score that is on the same metric as any other subset of those items. Now, the most important thing about developing a quality item bank is that you've got to really make sure that the items themselves are, in fact, really have very strong psychometric qualities. For example, the questions need to be easy to understand. It's also very important that there's a shared understanding across individuals. At University of Washington, when I was there, we led in the development of the pain interference and pain severity, pain behavior, and pain quality items for PROMIS. And I remember in one of our groups, we were talking about pain qualities, and some people experience what they would describe as a cold sensation, a painful cold sensation. So we were doing some cognitive interviews with some folks, and we asked them about their experience of cold pain. And this one person said, well, you know, it's been a fairly warm winter in UW, right? I mean, in Seattle. Another one was asked about shooting pain, and he responded, well, I've been shot before. I know what shooting pain's like. And so it's very important, and it's also often very surprising how other people read questions. And it is not enough for experts to sit in a room and decide, yeah, you know, I understand that. It's very important to find out how those questions are read by patients, by people who report, and by different types of people. The other really critical thing, of course, is the validity issue. Do the items of the item bank all measure the construct that you've intended to measure? And to get all of these really rigorous qualities, it's important that we use rigorous qualitative and quantitative measures. And I'm going to give you some examples of the qualitative methods. And this is a subset of the ones that were used in the development of the PROMIS measures and the Toolbox measures. The very first step in developing a measure is the definition of a construct. And I cannot tell you how many times people publish a measure without ever telling you how they defined the construct. But it is critical because it really defines the boundaries around which you're going to, you want to include your items. For example, there was an old study in JAMA one time that counted the percentage of people who said they used a quality of life measure and never explained what they meant by quality of life. And the percentage that actually did was in the embarrassing low 20 percentile, I think. So here are some of the things that were done. Definition of construct, also identification of existing measures. There were for some constructs, we actually identified literally thousands of items that had already been written and were in the public domain. We also then, in spite of having all of those items, we went to focus groups with patients and we said, tell us about your experience of fatigue. Tell us about your experience of pain. Tell us about your experience of anxiety. So we wanted to make sure that even though all of those items were out there, that there weren't things that we were missing. And this is a real key idea to the notion of construct validity. The idea that you have items that represent the construct of interest and that you're not leaving things out that are really important. So the next thing that happened was an expert review, consensus, revision of items. We went through and we did what we called binning and winnowing, which was a process of trying to get down to a smaller subset of items. And this was with clinical experts, people who actually, besides not just psychometricians like myself, but people who actually know things about patients were included, thank God. And then once we had a smaller set of items, we went out and did the interviews like I just described, cognitive interviews, where we had somebody read an item and say, you know, tell us what that item means to you. You know, what are you thinking? Think aloud as you describe how you're processing that information. We didn't say processing. Think aloud as you tell us how as you read that answer, what you're thinking about. And then another really important step, and one that I had really not had any experience with before, was we went through a review of all of the items to ensure their cultural sensitivity, of course, I was aware of that, but their translatability. Because we knew that the PROMIS items were going to later be translated into a number of different languages. We have at Northwestern, we have a group that's job they do a lot of translations of measures. And so they read through the items and they could tell us this particular construct is not going to be easy to translate into Spanish. And so they gave us feedback. So we did our best when we had an option to try to find wording that could be effectively translated into other languages. And then, as you can imagine, you get that feedback, and then you make revisions and you repeat as necessary. The quantitative methods, I've promised myself I will not bore you with those, even though those are the ones I really like to talk about. But we did large-scale testing, made sure that at least 500 people answered every single item. There were actually greater than 20,000 people in the very first collection of data for PROMIS. There had to be 20,000 because there were so many items that were tested. And then the statistical analysis, you'll recognize some of these: dimensionality, differential item function, and whether they fit to the model, the mathematical model that we're using to calibrate all these together, called item response theory. And then finally, final decisions were made about whether to include items in the bank or exclude items from the bank. I think the largest banks actually have close to 80 items, and then there's some that have under 30 items. So the number of items that were included in the final banks depended on the quality of those items. So we didn't have any kind of rule like we have to have 50 or something like that. So again, with an item bank, you've got many formats, but one metric, some other point. I can share with you some tutorials that I've done, like some online tutorials that I can do that could tell you more about the math behind it if you're interested in it. So, but the idea is that you could have a short form on the same metric, a long form on the same metric, and also computer adaptive testing, which goes by the very nice acronym CAT, which makes it fun to develop slides for. So let's take a look at the PROMIS umbrella, because there are a couple things in the PROMIS umbrella and it's easy to get it confused. And here's where we've got some animations too that maybe will help make some sense out of the stuff that I've said earlier. So under the PROMIS umbrella, you've got this collection of item banks that I've just described. So these are sets of items all measuring a single construct. They're unidimensional, and they are all calibrated to a common mathematical metric. Now, I'm going to use for the next few slides the example of physical function because it's an easy one to make this make sense out of. The other side of PROMIS is what's called the assessment center, and I'll talk more about it in a few minutes, but I want you to know at the beginning, we're talking about two different things. One is the content, what the actual measures are, and the other is how they get delivered and administered. All right, so let's start with item banks and physical function. So one thing about an item bank, in addition to having all the quality items like we talked about, we really want to make sure that it covers the whole range of the domain. If you're measuring physical function, it would not be appropriate to only include items about mobility, because physical function includes things you do with your hands, and it includes a lot of stuff, right? And so it's very important in terms of the construct validity that it is not limited to subsets of the domain that you're measuring. Now, it is possible to divide up so that you could have an upper body and a lower body. In fact, we're working on that, physical function banks. But whatever you call it, it should include items from each of that. All right, so the next thing that happens is we apply some mathematics, and items are calibrated to a common metric. Think about that as being just arranged by difficulty. So let's take the example of physical function item bank. As you can imagine, there are a whole range of levels of physical function, from being perhaps confined to a bed to being a high-level athlete. And so with those items, we have a number of different items. As a whole, you can think of it as a kind of a universe of items that could be written that address and target these levels of physical function. And whatever ones that we're using are a subsample or a sample of those universe of items. Now, the next step that happens then is we're defining a continuum in which that goes from low to high functioning. The calibration process then is lining these items all up along that mathematical metric. So let's think about how the CAT works. So it's called computer adaptive testing, and that's because it adapts to how people answer the questions. If you went and took the graduate record examination today, this is how it would be administered to you. If you and I go and take the GRE, the first item would be probably a middle difficulty item. If you got it right, the next item you got would be more difficult. If I got it wrong, the next item I got would be less difficult. And by tailoring like this, you're able to narrow in on a person's trait level much more quickly than if you ask everybody all the same questions. So let's see how this might work. So the CAT goes, and it looks, if you know nothing about a person, then you tend to guess they're at the middle, right? So it identifies a middle level item, and then it administers to this person that we know nothing about. Well, let's suppose for a second that this person is, in fact, a high-level athlete. She's going to answer that item in a way that says to the CAT algorithm, hey, this person has higher, higher, not lower physical function. So the CAT algorithm then goes and searches the item bank again and picks a higher level difficulty item and administers that item. And depending on the response to that item, it continues to narrow down, picking items for this person until finally enough items have been administered until you can get a precise level estimate of their level of trait. So let's suppose, though, that the first item is answered by someone with lower level of physical function. Then the same thing would happen, but this time the CAT algorithm would go and identify a lower level item and administer this. And again, this would continue and be applied until we reach some level of precision. So the idea here is even though you've got persons with low level of function and high level of function, we've been able to use this approach to line them up on the same continuum from low to high. So the CAT algorithm, when it first starts, it's only asked one or two questions. So the range of confidence in what this person's level of trait is fairly large. You've only asked a couple of questions. But very quickly, and because it's adaptive, that range of trait gets narrower and narrower. Now this process continues until either you can specify when you do a computer adaptive test, I want you to ask everybody 8 items. Or you can say, I want you to continue until you reach a specified level of precision, until that confidence interval around that estimate is this wide. And that continues, and we call those rules stopping rules. So because it tells the CAT when to quit doing this, because otherwise it would just keep on going until it's exhausted the whole bank. So why bother? I've just described a very sophisticated and technically intense approach to measurement. And it was one of the first questions that I learned to ask in my academic career because of some missteps early on was, who cares, right? Well, the reason that PROMIS decided to care, Toolbox decided to care, is that if you think of measurement efficiency as the amount of precision in estimates that you get compared to the number of items that you administer, then what you really want to do is maximize that efficiency. And doing this kind of assessment computer adaptively allows you to maximize efficiency. That means you're reducing the respondent burden. Very important that if you're administering a measure of fatigue impact to patients who have chronic fatigue syndrome, that you don't ask them 120 questions about fatigue, right? The other thing is by limiting the response burden and yet still getting good precision, it makes room for measuring more domains. And more we realize just how many things are correlated with the stuff that we want to measure. In order to capture that and really get a picture of how things are affecting patients, it really doesn't suffice to just measure a single thing. So there's one more advantage of PROMIS and Toolbox, and it's this whole metric thing that I described. So you have this metric that goes from low to high. So you got to get scores. Well, the way that the scores were calibrated in PROMIS, and later I'll show you in Toolbox, is that the middle, the center, was calibrated to a 2010 U.S. Census sample. So you got these 20,000 people that I mentioned in wave one, and a subsample of those was taken that matched the U.S. Census in age, in gender, and in race ethnicity. Now, important for you to know, it did not match the U.S. population in education, in SES. It did not do that. That would be a very expensive undertaking to get that level of norming. But it did at least give us an idea. It did account for several variables that do happen to be impactful on health outcomes. So it's at the 2010 census. I'm sorry, that should be 2000 census, not 2010. So the scores of PROMIS and of Toolbox are on what's called a T-score metric. You may know about this. It has a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 10. Now, what's really nice about this is because it's on this metric, then the scores themselves, when you get a score of 60, you have some inherent understanding of what that means. You know that a score of 60 is a standard deviation above the population mean, as opposed to when you get a raw score on some measure and it says you got a 16. It's like, great, is that good? Is that bad? Generally the way we get some sense of interpretability of measures is that we use them for a long time, and so we kind of develop this sense of, what level of oswestry is a problem? What level of the brief pain inventory should I be worried about? Those kinds of things. But in this way, it really gives you a marker, some kind of standard to compare it to. A score of 40 then would be a standard deviation below the mean, and scores have inherent meaning. So very quickly then, unfortunately, I set my timer, but it requires me to put my password in every time it goes off. So you will excuse me as I have failed to start my timer. 20 minutes is great. I think that's exactly how much I have to say. So, all right. So let's talk about the other part of the assessment, the PROMIS umbrella, and that's the assessment center. So you have these huge item banks. You have this nifty way of assessing, if you want to, through computer adaptive testing. And also, by the way, you can print out short forms and administer them too, and still get a score with a concordance table. You can get a score that's on the same metric. So, but what about the assessment center? The assessment center is this free online data collection tool, and it really is free. So if you set up a study, you could go online and decide which measures to use. And what it does is it creates, once you've decided which measures you want, it creates a secure, your study-specific website for capturing participant data. So you go in, you put in what measures you want. You can include your own introduction page. You could include informed consent. You can add your own measures that are not part of PROMIS. And then once it's published, you have a link that patients can actually go to and take that assessment. You can also put in parameters like, suppose you're paying people to take it, and you only have a certain amount of money to spend, and you want to limit it to, stop administering after you get to 100 people. You can make that kind of decision. And you can decide to do short forms. You can decide to do it computer adaptively. So once your study is loaded up into the assessment center with all its own particular hybridization, then you get your website. Everybody is able to go to that website that you give that link to and take your assessment. And you can do it by CAT. All right, that's PROMIS. Now I'm going to shift to Toolbox a little bit. I don't think we're asking questions yet, right? So I should just keep on moving. Okay, NIH Toolbox. I guess it was just me that felt the need for a break. So there is the online website, and it'll be there for you if you'd like to look at it later. So the Toolbox scope is a little different from PROMIS. The idea behind PROMIS was to develop measures of outcomes that were important to a lot of different chronic conditions. Toolbox, on the other hand, was funded by the National Institute of Neurologic, NINDS, right? Neurologic disorders. So their focus is much more narrow in terms of sets of things, but in some ways, the things that are measured are broader. I'll show you what I mean in a minute. So the idea was to get multidimensional sets of brief measures that could assess all of these things: cognitive, emotional, motor, and sensory function. And very important that it could do it across the lifespan, from age 3 to 85. Actually, beyond 85, but it was, anyway. All right, so NIH Toolbox, this collection of neurologic measures and behavioral measures over time and across developmental stages. The strategy of developing the Toolbox measures was, first, if there's an existing measure out there that does a good job, then great, adopt it. And the reason is it's familiar already to the research community, and it avoids duplication of effort. Now, by the way, all of the Toolbox measures are, there's no royalty fees or anything like that associated with them. So this is literally your tax dollars at work. When, in fact, there was no good option, then Toolbox used novel strategies to actually develop measures where needed. Just like PROMIS, Toolbox used these modern psychometric approaches and methods by developing item banks, by making it so that you could administer using CAT and fixed forms. I really think that though there's some advantages to CAT and the tools that PROMIS uses, where you really see CAT shine is in the NIH Toolbox. And the reason is that the kinds of things that are measured are often ones that, including things that are right, wrong, right? Like memory and vocabulary and things like that. And whereas CAT makes it more efficient to use self-report measures about emotion, fatigue, and things like that, on the right-wrong type questions, it really increases efficiency. And in fact, you can get similar efficiency in right-wrong type answers or yes-no type answers with about 1/10 of the number of items using a CAT. Not so much, not true. I think you get maybe like a 40% increase with a more self-report where it's Likert type item, because those kinds of items are really spreading across a whole range of trait. But dichotomous items they're targeting one level of trait at a time. Which reminds me of this cartoon. You can see the examiner behind the desk. For a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. So the Toolbox is trying to avoid everybody climbing that tree. So I mentioned that it's across the lifespan, which means that some of the measures for the younger group are self-administered, but some are also parent proxy. The age divisions for the Toolbox are adult, defined as over 18, then 13 to 17, 8 to 12, and 3 to 7. So there are often different measures, or there are different ways it's administered depending on the age. So let's look at the Toolbox domains. And I'm about to be in the area where I said that I really am not going to know much about what I'm talking about. So this is your area, so I'll allow you to fix me. All right? So these are the 4 large areas that the Toolbox chose to concentrate on: emotion, cognition, motor, and sensation. Let's take a look at some of those. So these 4 domains, the idea was to get batteries of tests. A battery is just a collection of measures. To get batteries of tests that would take no more than 30 minutes to administer. There was both English and Spanish versions, and they are fully normed in the same way that I mentioned for PROMIS for ages 3 to 85. So that's very nice because you've got age-based norms as well as national norms. There are 108 total instruments in the toolbox. Now, I said it takes 30 minutes to do a domain level battery. Some of these instruments are in fact supplemental, so you might not choose to administer them. The qualitative standards are the same in Toolbox. Expert surveys were used to create selection criteria, focus group interviews, expert interviews, and then I say they because I was late in the project, they also administered surveys for people who were content experts in the field so they could nominate and rank subdomains and constructs and say, what's needed by the field, what's important to you. So this is the cognition domain framework. And I mainly just included because I think this is probably one that you guys might be interested in. I just want to show you all the subdomains that are included under the Cognition and Toolbox. Executive function attention. I'm speaking words I know very little bit about. Working memory, episodic memory, language, and processing speed. And this chart also shows what the Toolbox tests were to measure each of those subdomains and also how they were validated. So I'm just going to pick one of those out, the language subdomain. And this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to take one of those big 4 circles, then I'm going to take one subdomain, and then I'm going to show you one example test. So the language subdomain, we wound up with the NIH Toolbox picture vocabulary test. And basically the task is a set of pictures are shown, and the examinee is told to click the picture that shows the meaning of the word. And I think it's a spoken word that's electronic to the test. The total trials, it's CAT administered, 25 to 30 items are administered, and you'd be surprised how quickly you can administer this many items when it's just point and click. So this is an actual example item. Like you hear the word baby, and or see the word baby. I apologize that I don't know that, and you do your best to answer. So here is the emotion domain framework. Again, this is one of those 4 bubbles. And you can see that underneath emotion, you've got all of these different things: psychological well-being, social relationships, stress and self-efficacy, negative affect. Now, here you'll see some overlap with PROMIS domains. And in fact, when PROMIS domains already existed, then those were appropriated to be used in the toolbox rather than starting all over. Now the third one that we look at is motor. I'm going to show you a dexterity measure. You know about the 9-hole pegboard dexterity measure. There's one practice and one test trial, and then you get the raw score, which is time in seconds to complete a trial. And then the sensation domain, and you can see what all of this includes. It's really interesting. There's like the olfaction where it's basically like scratch and sniff test, or I think it's actually droppers or something, but you actually try to identify different smells. Vestibular, so balance, etc. I figured you guys would be interested in audition. And because you were interested in it, not because I know anything about it, I'll show you this. These are the toolbox measures. Words in noise, the English version and the Spanish version. Do you guys know what that is? Yay! All right. Then I'll just read this and you'll nod. Monosyllabic, high-frequency words like red and mouse. 7 signal-to-babble ratios. That sounds like my Friday night. Hearing tested separately in each ear, randomized order. So I think these are probably, this is kind of the thing that you see. And this is just an example. So I will end with some Toolbox particulars. The measures have no licensing fees, as I mentioned before. There are some equipment costs for some of them. You can imagine for like the smell test, you have to buy the odors. You have to order the odor. There's more information on the website if you'd like to know more. And there are also a number of publications where you can see the validation of these instruments. There's a neurology special issue that was supposed to come out this fall. It's my understanding that it is very near not fall, so I think it might not be until the first of next year. But in that neurology supplement, there are each domain. There's a paper about each domain and about how the measures were norms. And so look for that in a theater near you. There's also in Research in Child Development a monograph that highlights pediatric use of the cognition battery. In Journal International Neuropsychology Society next year, again coming soon, highlights adult use of the cognition battery. So in summary then, PROMIS and Toolbox are efforts that really try to get broad measures, broad in terms of scope, broad in terms of the populations for which they are appropriate for, normed so that you have some understanding of what a score means relative to some relevant population, efficient in the sense that there are you can use computer adaptive testing, but you can also use short forms and hand them out and score them by hand. And quality, one of the biggest, the foundation block of all of the instruments that I've described, both those in PROMIS and in Toolbox, were very sometimes tedious methodological interest in qualitative research to ensure the quality of the individual items, because without quality of individual items, there's no such thing as quality measures. Okay.
Thank you so much, Karon. We are going to take questions, so please, thank you. And I look for Linda Resnick from the Providence VA and Brown University.
Thank you for a great talk and a really wonderful overview of these initiatives. I'm just curious, both of these initiatives use constructs and develop measures of specific clinically relevant constructs, but there's no use of ICF terminology, taxonomy, and there's a big push for that and mapping of measures to the ICF. And is there any effort to make that happen?
Yeah, there's some awareness within PROMIS. I don't know about Toolbox, but I know that there's some awareness in PROMIS about the advantages of that kind of mapping, and there are some efforts. Forgive me because I don't know who is involved with that, but we know each other. Contact me later. But no, that was not the framework we started. That was started from. We started with the. I forget. It was in a slide that I decided not to torture you with too many slides, and I'm afraid I took it out. But again, there is awareness of that and interest in doing some of that mapping. Yeah.
Jacob Keene from Indiana University.
Hi, Karon.
Hey.
A question about CAT. So you have many well-validated legacy measures that existed for certain constructs. What does a CAT do if you feed it different item structures? So I know that a lot of the work in building these measures has gone into standardizing the item structures and things so that the CAT can operate well. What about, could you take a collection of legacy measures and build a bank there, knowing that those are well validated? What does a CAT do in that case?
Yeah, you actually can do. In fact, in spine, I have a publication a couple years ago in which we took the Roland Morris and simulated what a CAT would do. Because if you have somebody who's taken all of the items, then you can, after the fact, apply a CAT algorithm and see what scores you would get. And it was much more efficient. The Roland Morris is very few items, so it's kind of a in some ways maybe a cheater's test. But I think with like 9 or 10 items, we were able to get very high scores that were very highly correlated. So cut in half.
And so what happens when you have items that have a different structure? I don't know if Roland Morris is that way.
Tell me what you mean by structure.
So if you had an item that was a binomial trials sort of item structure, you have multiple attempts, and then another one where it's a rating scale item. How do items like that work together?
So the item response theory model, which is a mathematical equation, can handle a lot of different things. It can handle items with different numbers of categories, even in a single run, with some items that have only 2 categories or some that had 8. With continuous data, it would have to be categorized at thresholds. So, of course, that's throwing away information. It is, in fact. But it might be a trade-off that's worth it. And if you were going to do that, you probably would not want to be arbitrary in those thresholds, but you might want to look at distributions, because sometimes you'll see, typically you don't see this, you see, sometimes like that. And so you try to find those kinds of places that would make clinical sense, for example, to create those markers. And then it becomes like any other item with multiple categories, and it can be calibrated using IRT. And by the way, with the computer adaptive testing, everybody, you kind of think, well, then the person's got to be in front of a computer, which is less and less a problem now. But it could also be an interviewer in front of the computer.
Hi, my name's Natalie Vanderveen. I'm one of the students that got a scholarship, and so I have a question for you. But I was just wondering, I got a chance to look through the PROMIS website before I came and look at some of the measures, and we're interested in traumatic brain injury, and so I can see a lot of the measures being relevant to that population. But I just wondered, in terms of like the language domain, it's maybe less broad than we would like it, and I was wondering if there were any if there was any push to expand PROMIS domains, or if it's kind of static where it is now. Like,
it's not at all static. No. In fact, I've heard the term "growing like a tumor." PROMIS is now not PROMIS 1 but PROMIS 2, and there are a number of investigators developing new measures. There is David Tulsky is developing some TBI banks, TBI and SCI, quality of life banks. He would be a good contact person for you. So you said language. When you say, you're talking about measures of language, or?
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, because I looked at Toolbox and PROMIS, and now I don't really remember. Are the language, were they the same?
So in PROMIS, there's no language.
There wasn't. Okay,
yeah,
so
Toolbox,
that's what I'm getting confused. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the contact for that, for the language, would be Richard Gershon, or you can contact me, because I'll be quicker to respond to your email. And I can put you in touch with the person who was head of the domain, because the people who worked on this were all over the country. So there's like this huge collection of investigators who were grouped by their content expertise. So there's a whole language group,
All right.
that speak a language I don't understand.
One thing, I'll walk and talk. One of the things that I think is really remarkable about this is the notion that we would be having...
Would you raise your hand, because I can't see you, I can't...
it's me as I'm walking and talking,
no
Margaret Rogers. I just wanted to point out that this greatly moves us forward in terms of having common data elements across studies, and it's a point that I think is obvious, but it's one of the reasons why I think it's so important.
I'm so glad you made that point, because I meant to say at the very beginning, it's the whole reason for doing this. There's a reason the NIH was interested in putting this kind of money in it, is the idea of having common data elements.
Hi, Lisa Millman from Utah State University. So I just had a question about NIH Toolbox and some of the quality measures. So where would we access classic psychometric data, like basic reliability on tests?
Yeah, so it will be in all those papers that are coming out. Of course, it will be there. There may be information on the website itself. The other thing you can do is contact me, and we could, before it's published, if you need that kind of information before it's published, I can find somebody who can get that information for you. Eventually,
Actually, I think that it would be really helpful to have a link or some domain on the general site to the psychometric properties, because when I hear something that there's quality about a particular test or measure, then what I want is some psychometric formula and some number, so I can say, oh, here's the reliability of this item, or this subtest, or this is the difficulty level or discriminability of this item, as opposed to just having, oh, this is a high quality test.
Exactly.
So
in God we trust, everyone else has to bring data,
Yeah, because I know I've been trying to track some of that down for the FIMS, and I know it's hard to access the information. So I think that would be a huge asset for me as a researcher or as a clinician to be able to have something equivalent to a classic test manual that's also available online. So it's not just the items, but it's the data to support the use of those items.
I'm glad you mentioned the tech manual. So the tech manual has been developed, and that's where all of that is. But it was developed, there was a big NIH conference when it was kind of shown to everybody. I think that was in October. So I don't know if the tech manual is online yet, but that's right, all of that is in there.
Excellent,
Yeah.
We have a question from Neela Donovan at LSU.
Hi, Neela Donovan from Louisiana State University. I attended a workshop that Alan Heinemann did at Rehab Institute in Chicago, and he is someone that's worked a lot on the Toolbox, I think.
Yes.
So the first time I saw the language measures, they seem so narrow compared to what we do in language, and I know the intent was the 30-minute total. And I guess and it looks very traditionally like the neuropsych thinking about measurement. And I was just curious if there were any speech-language pathology or language researchers in that portion of the NIH language group.
In that particular context.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Is there a way to look up who the members are?
Yeah, if you email me, because there may be a quick way to do this.
Okay.
But if you email me, you can count on me following through.
Okay, I think Lana knows. I'll just talk to her.
Okay.
And thank you. I think Neela's point could be taken as a point of advocacy. I'm sure there are many in this room that would gladly give their time to contribute this. Raul Srivastav from Michigan.
Thank you, Karon. That's excellent presentation. I have a question on the Toolbox and a question on PROMIS. So the PROMIS one first, because that's your favorite.
It's not my favorite. It's just something I know a little bit more about.
If the items on the tests are not rank orders, but are on interval or ratio scales, does that need any modification?
So as soon as my flex spending account starts in January, I'm getting hearing aids, seriously. So I'm going to ask you to try one more time.
If the items on any test that you administer using computerized adaptive testing, if it's not rank orders, but has specific distances between items, does that need any modifications to the adaptive testing procedure?
So what I gave is a fairly simplistic, animation of what happens. It's actually a mathematical formula that does that calibration and that estimates the actual distance between item parameters. And it won't be like that, it'd be, like more like that. And so it's not like you have to rank them ahead of time. The mathematics of it does that ranking. And then some IRT models take into account not just the difficulty of the item, but also the discrimination of the item. So does that?
It sort of addresses that.
So if you, again, if you email me, and it's Karon, Karon .Cook @northwestern.edu. I can also send you links to sort of these animation things about item response theory that kind of goes through how all that works, the mathematics of that, and that might make it more clear too.
So is item response theory fundamentally different than choice theory or signal detection theory in terms of?
Choice theory?
Yeah,
I don't know what choice theory is.
the business community uses the choice theory.
Yeah.
Audiology and engineering uses signal detection theory. So I'm trying to understand if there are fundamental theoretical differences or not.
Okay, so let me give you a 1-minute explanation of item response theory. Okay, item response theory is it's a mathematical formula, and for every item, let's talk about dichotomous items. You get it right, you get it wrong. For every item, it estimates the probability that you'll say you'll get it right or you'll get it wrong, conditioned on how much you have of the trait that's being measured. And then the way it's scored is it looks at the pattern of responses that you made, which ones you got right, which ones you got wrong, and it takes that information mathematically and the information it knows about the items regarding their characteristics, like their difficulty, and together it makes a best guess estimate of what your trait level is. In other words, it gives the trait level that would be the most likely to happen, the most likely to create those responses. And it is literally an equation that defines a little S-curve function. And down on the bottom right here is your trait level, and on this side right here is a probability. And so that equation, it finds a whole lot of them, right? But for every item, it defines as if it's yes, no. It says if you don't have very much of the trait down here, then you're very unlikely to get it right. So this starts down here. More the trait that you get going this way, then you see the probability goes up. And that mathematical equation is what does that. So that is a 1-minute description of item response theory.
I'd also like to mention that in the American Journal of Speech-Language Pathology, Carolyn Baylor, Will Hula, and other authors in this room have a lovely tutorial on item response theory that I think is very accessible both to clinicians as well as to researchers.
I'm sorry, tell me again where that is?
That is in the American Journal of Speech-Language Pathology.
This year?
It was in 2011, was it not, Carolyn? 2011.
Great.
Carolyn Baylor.
I look forward to it. I have a collection, I have a file that I call Cogent Descriptions of Difficult Constructs, so I will print it off and add it to my file.
I don't like that file. Are there any other questions? If not, let's thank Karon once more.
Thank you.